Good afternoon, everyone. We've got a few more folks coming in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. All right, welcome everyone to NCME's webinar series on COVID's impact on assessments. My name is Susan Davis-Becker. I have the honor of being your moderator for what hopes to be another exciting discussion today. Today we're looking at a topic about, we're continuing our discussion on credentialing. We talked about credentialing last week, but today we're looking at the impact on policies and design. And we probably get back into the topic we discussed last week of remote test administration. So I'm very excited that we're continuing this webinar, but if you have missed any of the previous sessions that are listed here, they're on the NCME YouTube channel, available to access for free. And we have 2 more coming up, March 11th and 18th, so make sure your calendars are blocked for those events. So today we're going to have another panel discussion. I'm very excited about this group of panelists that have kindly volunteered their time to share their experiences with us. Our panelists include Phil Dickinson from the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, Judith Gunderson from the National Conference of Bar Examiners, and Pooja Shivraj from the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology. So these 3 individuals represent very different credentialing programs in terms of design and structure and format. But they were all faced with the same challenge just about 1 year ago today, which was their operations were drastically disrupted by COVID. And so we wanted to have this session to give them each the opportunity to share about what that disruption looked like, what challenges they were faced with, knowing that they still had to meet the needs of their examinees and stakeholders, and how they went past those challenges. And now the scary part, how we can look at it looking back now almost a year later for some of these decisions. So I welcome you to add your comments and questions into the chat. We will be keeping everyone on mute so that we can keep going with our presentations. After each presenter has an opportunity to share a little bit of background on their program and kind of what they experienced over the past year, I've got some questions I want to ask of our panel, and then we'll try to work in your questions from the chat. Okay, so let's dive in and get started. So first we're going to hear from Phil. I'm going to ask each of our presenters to introduce themselves a little bit and then share more about their program and their experience with COVID.
Thanks, Susan. I appreciate that. So welcome. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. I'm sure you can read this. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Mostly, I'm referred to as Phil. And so that's good enough for me. If you remember Phil, that'll work just fine for me. I started with the National Council 12 years ago as their director of exams. I am a nurse, a psychometrician, as well as a background in business through Mount Vernon Nazarene College. 3 years ago, I added to my job responsibilities, become chief of exams and also chief operation officer for the council. In retrospect, once this hit, that became, I was not only problem of the operations of the council, but the exam. I will tell you, you don't ever want to be in that position because you're holding two decision positions that become very problematic. And if you're schizophrenic, you fight with yourself. So any of you fought with your psychometrician or your chief officer of operations? Yeah, that was me at night in my own head doing that, of what's right and wrong, depending on which hat I had on. So ultimately, I am responsible for all the exams, the exam programs. I'm responsible for human resources, performance measurement standards, marketing, communication, and the general operations of all programs at the National Council. History, I started out in the United States Air Force as a medic, after I left as a medic, I became a basic exam coordinator for the National Register of EMTs, where I progressed to become their psychometrician and director of their EMS programs for 19 years. Took a small stint with Test Prep Group, Elsevier, and 12 years ago started the council, and that's where I am today. So that's about me. Susan, if we can look at the next slide, let me give a brief overview of what the council does, what its purpose is, why it exists, and then I'll tell you how our exam works, and then get into some of the issues that approached us, as Susan said, a year ago. But ultimately, our mission is actually not just to provide exams, but we provide education, service, and research that promote evidence-based regulatory excellence, patient safety, public protection. And if you had to think about it, our stakeholders ultimately are not the profession. Our stakeholders are the regulators. And so that's why it talks about sort of evidence-based regulation. So we have a responsibility, every board of nursing in the United States, all the territories, as well as 9 of the provinces in Canada, and they're not called boards, they're called colleges of nursing. So they all use the exam as a regulatory tool to issue licensure to nurses. Our vision is what we shoot for is advancing regulatory excellence worldwide, and our values are what drive us to do that. You can see those. I don't need to read those to you, but I wanted to give you sort of an overview. Now I'll talk specifically, next slide, about the exam and how that operates. So I've already told you it's used for licensure in all the United States and Canada. It is a computer adaptive delivery mechanism. And more importantly, it is a variable length computer adaptive exam. So if you think about it in these terms, and it'll help you when I talk about how we had to come to solutions, that exam is delivered every day at Pearson Professional Centers. So it's an on-demand exam. By that, I mean on-demand if you have an authorization to test. So you have to go through such your appointment, but there are appointments every day throughout the year. And we test approximately 300,000 a year. Of that's split a little bit between 2 levels of programs or examinations, if you will, the registered nurse and the practical nurse. The largest testing volume there is the registered nurse, which is around close to 200,000, and the PNs, which are a little over 100,000. We have a secondary or tertiary exam program called Nurse Aids, which is not in every state, and it is a bit more distributed through Pearson VUE on a state-based model, not a national model. We test probably somewhere around 100,000 of those as well. But the majority of things I want to talk about today are how we responded to the RNs and PNs. I would answer any questions around the nurse aides. We did manage that as well, but it was a different management because it's a different exam. The nurse aide is not computer adaptive. It is a linear based exam that in some cases, because it's state-based, is pen and paper. Other places it's computer, and it has a clinical component. So it was a different solution set there. The cost of our exam is $200 per candidate, and we have a service level agreement that we will deliver results within 24 hours to the Board of Nursing, who then takes that and issues a license. That may take 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 day. That's a state issue, but we give the exam results in 24 hours. We publish a new pool for the variable length CAT every 3 months. So it is an item writing machine. Those of you that are in test development, I can tell you that is a big job. And as I tell many people, we have to view item development as a program, not a product. Because a product says, I built these items, I can put in the bank and walk away. We have to build items every day to keep up with this. If you've used CAT, you know it's an item eater. And so we publish every 3 months to ensure exposure rates on our exam, as well as ensuring that there are no duplicate items from month to month, or from quarter to quarter, I should say. So we produce about 6,000 test questions a year for each of for the exams, and about 4,900 volunteers help us do that throughout that entire year. So you can imagine when we went to COVID, all of this became a problem. So let me get to the sort of how were we impacted by COVID. Let's be clear, all of you are probably impacted similar. I got a 24-hour notice from our test vendor, which is Pearson VUE, that said effective tomorrow at some time, there will be no seats for your candidates. Now remember, what did that mean? That meant we had a variety of numbers from various states who had already scheduled their candidates. So one of the problems is you had people that were to arrive the next day, and there was no plan at that time, because it was just that, crisis happens. That's what happens. There's nothing after that. Was that we also had a whole backlog of candidates who needed to schedule the test. So ultimately, the worst thing that could have happened to us was when it happened, in that was the start of our peak. We test about 60% of our entire population of 300,000 tests starting in March through July. And so the predicted backlog was going to be hundreds of thousands if we couldn't get it open. And that was a big deal. Immediately went into crisis mode. Now, one of the things that we had in place that I would suggest, if you don't have in place, you do, is a crisis response team and a crisis communication process, meaning that titles no longer matter and organizational structure no longer matters. What mattered was, and I took a bit of a military approach from the Air Force, was what matters is now whether you're the chief or you were director of exams, whatever, it doesn't matter, because a new team steps in place. Now you could, but what I'm saying is your title didn't matter, because you had to centralize the crisis management and communication. So we took that step immediately, did some quick analysis. I can tell you within 30 days, our revenues were down for the month more than 50%. So that has a financial impact, right? So we immediately said, we've got to solve this for 2 reasons. But what is the real reason? Well, we had a reserve fund. So we built a reserve fund. So the finances weren't the biggest issue to us. It was public safety. And when you think about who we tested, we needed nurses into the workforce. And we were holding out somewhere eventually around 70,000 individuals that could have been in the workforce that were going to be a problem in the pandemic. So we said, let's focus on that problem. So solve one problem at a time is, how do we make this happen? We immediately called Pearson VUE, our contacts there, said, what are your plans? They didn't necessarily they were in the same state we were, which is shut this down. So we started a communication plan with them about how to remedy this. One of the debates we made was that, how about we get ourselves labeled as essential services, and perhaps we can get these exams open. And we were able to do that, but remember, there was social distancing. So no matter what happened, Once I opened that test center, I was still 50% below capacity, no matter how it worked out. And did the numbers, said that's not going to work. We're still going to have a workforce shortage in the middle of this pandemic come June or July. What can we do about it? So we again work with Pearson VUE. We asked them a couple things. One, could we in fact open the centers so that instead of having a single shift, could they go to double shift and triple shift? Pearson was really helping us with that, and they said, well, they could do that, but there was a problem. And that problem was they didn't have staff for that because staff were at stay-at-home orders and a variety of things were going on. So we started an aggressive campaign with them and using our regulatory partners to identify volunteers that would be, we started with volunteers, went to recruits that would be willing to take the training with Pearson and become Pearson employees for a period of time so that they could have staffing at the PPCs. Our goal was to hire over a period of 3 months, 800 of these individuals. That was surpassed based on help from our regulatory bodies of getting the message out, Pearson getting the message out. And so we did that. What I had hoped in my mathematical calculations on that is we could get to about 75% of the workforce. That still wasn't enough. And so the idea at that point in time was, what else can we do? And we took a very drastic step. So we investigated, would we go to remote proctoring? Was there a way to do it? Talked to Pearson a bit about that. Decided that remote proctoring had some problems with it that we weren't willing to accept at that time. We couldn't assure the security at the level that we expected, that we've come to expect around our exam. And our worry is if we couldn't do that, then the validity of our final results and the legitimacy of decisions made around those results could be called into question. And so that became sort of a non-starter after we evaluated it. So we said, what's another way? Well, it was sort of simple math to us. Look, our test is 6 hours long. One of the ways we said to actually increase capacity is shorten the test. So if we took 2 hours off the test, we actually added another nurse per seat throughout the day on a 2 shifts and actually 3 on a 3 shift. So we said, let's investigate that. What would happen if we shortened the exam? Another nice thing is we had all this data. So I tasked a team in 72 hours, our psychometric team. I said, in 72 hours, I need answers to these questions. So we tasked them around the clock to run simulations of a variety of things. Shorten the exam by 2 hours and tell me, do we impact the run out of time, the maximum length? Do we impact the error around our final decision? And how did we do that? So we took all of last year's data because we had it, shortened the exam and run every keystroke back through the new exam to see if it changed results, changed the item parameters. It did not in any way. The one thing it did do was increase run out of time by 0.5%, but our run out of time was around 2% anyway. So we were willing to go, you know what? 2.5% run out of time is still not considered a speeded test. We will consider that a power test, and we will launch this exam. So once we did that, I can tell you that by July, we had recovered. And in fact, today, I can tell you that at the end of that cycle, which was for us December, so for the year, we actually, during the pandemic, tested more people this year by about 4% than we did the previous year. Now, where that 4% came from, I don't know. I'm still trying to investigate. Did people just choose to take the test that wouldn't have taken it before? I'm not sure. But we do know that there was no impact on the pass rate. There were no impact on the decision consistency, the item parameters. The only impact was, as I said, on the run out of time. and the number of people that approached maximum length exam. We considered that success. Making those decisions to modify the program was a collective effort. And I will tell you that without the support of the leadership, both with our testing partner, Pearson, our regulatory bodies, and our executive leadership at the council, would have been more difficult. Keeping the communication going was particularly important. And I think I have enough time to tell this. I'll close with this, Susan, is that the communication piece became identifying the stakeholders. And one of the big stakeholders were the disenfranchised candidates, because there was at one point where we had to unschedule early on. Remember, the pandemic happened. We had people in the queue. We had to unschedule them because there were no test seats for them. In one day, we had to unschedule around 10,000 candidates and notify them and handle the PR around that. So that didn't go well, by the way. I can tell you that when we had to do it the next time around, which was around 6,000, that we had adjusted that communication to make it a better communication, to notify our regulatory bodies in advance of it happening so they didn't get the calls. And so it did take us one round to figure out that we didn't handle that very well, but we're very flexible and agile to fix that. And with that, I know other people are going to have their stories to tell. I won't take their time. I'll wait for some questions from you. So Susan, thank you.
Thanks, Phil. All right, I'm going to turn this over to Judith Gunderson.
Thank you, Susan. And hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. Listening to Phil, there was a lot where I nodded my head and thought, yes, that sounds familiar. But there are a lot of really important differences between the program that I run and the program that Phil runs. My name is Judy Gunderson. I'm president of the National Conference of Bar Examiners. I've been at NCBE for over 20 years now. I've been in the presidency for a little over 3 years, and before that, for 17 years, I worked in our testing department. We develop 4 exams that are used in lawyer licensing, and I staffed 3 of those programs at one time or another. Every jurisdiction in the country uses at least one of our 4 exams involved in lawyer licensing. Most use 3 of those exams. They are the MBE, that's the multi-state bar exam. It's a 200-question multiple choice exam. The MEE, the multi-state essay exam, which is a 6-question half-day essay question. And then the MPT, the multi-state performance test, which are 2 90-minute skills or performance test questions. So those 3 tests, the MBE, the MEE, and the MPT, constitute the bar exam. 40 states currently use or will use all 3 of those components for something called the uniform bar exam. And that's something that means that for people who take that test, they can transport those scores to other states. So let's say I sat for the exam in New York and my law firm also has a practice in DC. I can transfer the score to DC, or I can transfer it, to Massachusetts, let's say. And that doesn't sound, that sounds like, well, of course you could do that, but that really wasn't the case before the uniform bar exam. So that's been around for about 10 years, and about 151,000 uniform scores have been earned, and that allows newly licensed lawyers score portability. That actually will be important as we go forward to keep in mind. Just a quick note, the 4th test that we develop is the multi-state professional responsibility exam, and that exam is administered at Pearson professional centers across the country. And, Phil got the call apparently last year that when they said, oh, guess what, the centers are all closed. I might be wrong, but I think our exams for the MPRE were the last exams that Pearson was actually able to administer at their test centers last year. Though that is an exam-based test 3 times a year, and that was given on March 12th and 13th, and then after that, the centers closed. So the actual bar exam, that is not administered by the National Conference of Bar Examiners. That is administered by each jurisdiction. And each jurisdiction's admission process is overseen by their Board of Bar Admissions or Board of Law Examiners. And those boards in turn are overseen by each state's highest court, which is usually the Supreme Court. So again, this is another key feature to keep in mind as I tell you what happened to us during COVID. So what that means before the pandemic, and it was an in-person paper-based test. The exam was administered under and scored under uniform conditions, same schedule, same time, same weight for components, same grading rubrics, similar security related conditions. But you can imagine it, you've got some states that have 10,000 examinees and some states that literally have 25 examinees. So there are really a lot of different logistical conditions and things to consider when you think about administering exam for such wildly different sized populations. Unlike the nursing exam, the bar exam is an event-based test. It is given twice a year at the end of February and the end of July. July's population is about double of February's, and that makes sense. People graduate from law school in May, and then they study for the exam, and they take the exam at the end of May or the end of July. So in July, I think last year or in 2019, there were about 43,000 people who sat. A little bit fewer numbers for last year. And then in February, the numbers always, they hover between about 19 and 20,000 or so. So that also means that we just administered the February exam, and I can talk to you a little bit more about that. So the exam is an event-based test twice a year in person. It is 12 hours. 6 hours are the 200 multiple choice questions, and the other 6 hours are the constructed response portion of the exam. It's given over 2 days. So pre-pandemic, the exam had always been a paper-based test. We ship paper test booklets. We ship Scantron sheets for the multiple choice exam, and jurisdictions administer those exams at convention centers, hotel ballrooms. That's typically been how these exams are administered. For the constructed response portion, we still delivered the exam using test booklets, but examinees would upload their answers, would write their answers and upload them on their own laptops. So they brought their own device to the in-person exam. And in that space for the software, the platform that would allow examinees to write their answers, but lock down their computers so they couldn't have access to their notes or to the internet. There were three vendors involved in that space, and then examinees, after they're done, they upload their answers, and then jurisdictions grade their answers. And so that's also something that we'll come back to as we go on and talk about what happened in 2020. So that's pre-March of 2020. We had just given the February exam, in-person traditional exam. So in that sense, I guess our timing, we got a little bit lucky for February and for March, as I had mentioned with the MPRE. But then as soon as the February exam was over, we knew we had to plan for July, and we knew that that was going to look very different. As Phil talked about, it wasn't an option for us, and it certainly wasn't an option for our stakeholders. Our primary stakeholders are state Supreme Courts and state boards of bar admissions to cancel the exam. There was one jurisdiction, a very small jurisdiction, that ended up canceling the July exam, but everyone else knew that they needed to find a way. And you might remember back about a year ago, I think we didn't know how long things were going to last, and I think we didn't know how bad things were going to get. And so where I live in Dane County, our government here took the pandemic very seriously. We shut down, no one came into work, and schools closed. And I think people thought, our our county government said, well, we can ease back in after 2 months. And, you know, I think about, like, as we were thinking about what our options were, the Boston Marathon is always run in mid-April on Patriots Day. And the Boston Marathon was rescheduled until September. So I think a lot of our stakeholders were thinking, well, gosh, the end of July looks really iffy, but we should be able to do something maybe later in fall. And so for us, the decision process involved our staff, it involved our stakeholders in 54 jurisdictions to come up with a few options. And the first option was keep the July exam because there might be some states that can actually give an in-person exam. And I guess, Susan, if you want to, you could put up the slide right now and you can see what the map looked like in July. And so, but in addition to keeping that July exam, we offered exams in early September and in late September. And those were all, so there were 3 in-person exams where we usually have just 1 in-person exam for the second half of any year. You know, there's always just that July exam. So, you know, it's not developing 4,900 new items every 3 months, but it's tripling test development. So I think some of our staff members are on this in this meeting. So a shout out to all of our staff members. As Phil said, it doesn't matter what hat you wear. You know, it's the development people, the IT people, the measurement people, the communications people. I mean, this was all hands on deck. So we offered 3 in-person exams. And initially, you know, several states, bigger states with, you know, I told you, you've got 10,000 in some states and you've got 25 in others. The bigger states decided, well, we certainly can't give it in July. Let's hold off and let's see if we can give it in fall. So pretty shortly after we had those 3 in-person dates set, again, administered by the jurisdictions, we knew we had to come up with a remote option in the event, particularly for some of these big states that they were simply not going to be able to bring people together. So then we added a remote option to be given after all the in-person exams were administered, and that was October 5th and 6th. And so in the end, this is what it looked like across the jurisdictions. Green is they gave an in-person exam at the end of July. So green is sort of the status quo. The states that are red gave the, I think all of them, maybe not Washington, but I think all of them gave an in-person exam at the end of July, and they gave another in-person exam in early September. The brown states, just a couple of them, they're the states that gave a July exam and they gave a late September exam. And the orange states gave an in-person exam and a remote exam. And the purple shaded states are the ones that just gave a remote exam. And there is a blue one there. And Maine and Utah just gave an in-person late September exam. There are some gray shaded states. They used their own materials and developed their own exam and gave that remotely. And so you can see there are 4 of those jurisdictions as well. And then 5 jurisdictions decided that it would not be fair to expect candidates to have to sit for a licensing exam with all the upheaval of the pandemic. And so 5 jurisdictions offered various cohorts of students. There wasn't a common approach, but they offered those students admission to the profession without taking a licensing exam. They call it diploma privilege. And that happened in 5 states. So, you know, shoot, you take a look at this map and you say, well, this is what happened. It sort of does look like a patchwork quilt. In part, that looks like a patchwork quilt because NCBE ourselves, we offered 4 options. And then some jurisdictions, I think there were 10 of them that offered 2 different licensing options for their candidates. So in the end, close to 28,000 people ended up taking a remote exam. Now I should back up a little bit and tell you that remote exam wasn't that full length uniform bar exam, that 12-hour 2-day exam we were very, unsure about this, right? Like I mean, the words remote exam would have never been part of my lexicon before a year ago. So we offered states, NCBE acted as the publisher only, and we offered our materials to any jurisdiction that wanted to use the remote exam free of charge. And the jurisdictions scored the exams on their own. We provided grading materials for the written materials and obviously the answer keys for the multiple choice exam. But it was a half an exam, so it was not 2 full days. It was over 2 days, but it was for 90-minute sessions. So in the end, as I said, 28,000 people took that remote exam. You can see there's a lot of green on that map, but those states and red and brown, we ended up with probably about 8,000 people who took an in-person exam. There were some other states, as you can see from gray shaded, that did their own materials. And I want to say that was maybe 2,500 people. And then about 1,200 people were admitted via diploma privilege. So if Susan, you could go ahead to the next slide now. So that's what July looked like. So look at the difference. Now this is the exam we just gave last week. So back in October, it just looked like the pandemic wasn't going anywhere and there was really not a lot of vaccine news. So we knew that we needed to meet our stakeholders' needs and give these law students a chance for licensure. So we again offered the remote exam. And with the exam that was just administered, the remote jurisdictions are the shaded green and the solid green are the jurisdictions that gave an in-person exam. We are getting data back from both of these different streams, but I'm guessing that this is going to end up about 2,000 people in person and about between 17 and 18,000 took the exam in a remote fashion. And this remote exam, NCBE is scoring, and it is a full-length uniform bar exam, portable score, 2 full days of testing. So, and then we've also just recently made an announcement in early February, again, given the state of affairs, that we'll be offering to jurisdictions another remote option for July. And I don't have a slide on that map, but so far there have been 11 jurisdictions that have announced because of the COVID restrictions and safety concerns, they're going to be giving the exam in a remote fashion.
Great, thanks, Judy. Quite a change from July to February, but still a lot of variation in there where normally it's a pretty standard process. Okay, next I'd like to welcome Pooja Shivraj.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, first of all, pleasure to be here. Thank you all for making it. And as I heard Phil and Judy talk, again, I think Judy mentioned this as well. There were so many struggles that we faced as well. That's common to both organizations. And so I'm going to try not to be repetitive, but also we faced similar struggles going through the whole thing. So as an introduction, I'm Pooja Shivraj, Manager of Research and Psychometrics at the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology. I have worked at the organization for about 3 years now, a little over 3 years. I've also worked in K-12 education prior to this at a university setting, as well as at a public school district as the Director of Research and Evaluation there. Next, please. Okay, so before going on to how we responded to the pandemic, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we do certification. So ABOG is a nonprofit organization that provides board certification to OB-GYNs across US and Canada for those who actually choose to pursue board certification. So it's not a mandatory process. And it's essentially a two-step process. We have a couple of exams. Once OB-GYNs graduate residency to become OB-GYN specialists, they can, if they choose to pursue board certification, they take a qualifying exam with us. The qualifying exam is a computer-based exam that has 180 multiple choice questions, and it's administered once annually in the summer at a testing site. If they pass that exam, they then a year later, they collect cases during while working as a physician, and then a year later take the certifying exam, which is an oral exam. It's face-to-face with examiners, two examiners. They give them structured cases, and it's administered November through February. So if you think about when the qualifying exam is given, it's given in July, June or July, and then they collect it for an entire year, their case list, their, that sort of thing, what they are practicing in the field. And then the November after that, November through February after that, they actually can take the certifying exam if they pass the qualifying exam. And so those are the exams that we have, and that's for specialists who who go through the residency program. They can also choose to do a fellowship. So if you think about OB-GYNs, they can go into a subspecialty. So people that want to go into, say, gynecology, oncology, so specifically focusing on like oncology sort of thing for gynecology. So they can go into a fellowship, a 3 to 4 year fellowship after they are done doing their residency. And then if they choose to go into a fellowship, we have exams for that as well. So then they take their qualifying exam for their fellowship, which is a subspecialty. And it's essentially the same process. They take the qualifying exam, and then a year later, they take the certifying exam, which is, again, a face-to-face oral exam. So essentially, if you think about subspecialists, they go through the qualifying exam, certifying exam, go through a fellowship, and then a qualifying exam and a certifying exam. And the reason I'm talking about all of this is because for each of these exams, we made a different accommodation based on a decision tree, the sample sizes taking it, that sort of thing. And so I wanted to talk about each of these exams individually, how it came about, because the first exam we hit, the certifying exam, for example, is administered in April for subspecialists. And the sample size, as you can imagine, is much smaller than the specialty sample size, which is much larger. It's about 1,600 or so. The subspecialists is between 50 and 100 annually. And so we first, when the pandemic started, hit the April subspecialty oral exams, the certifying exams, then came to the qualifying exams for everyone, the specialists and the subspecialists, and then hit the November through February exams, which are the oral exams for specialty. So I wanted to talk about each one of those individually, along with their sample sizes, the logistics, our decision tree, that sort of thing. So I'm going to keep this slide up so you can see each of the timelines and the sample sizes as I go through them. And you can type in any questions if you have them as I go along. Okay, so in thinking about when the pandemic started, Texas, we decided to start a little bit late, but April was the first exam that hit, which was the subspecialty certifying exam. And at that point, we decided to just slate it for later this year, and we just moved it to November, along with what we thought would be, we can just administer it with all the other specialist exams that came along. We didn't know how long the pandemic would last, but we thought we can just probably combine it as another day along with our other specialty exams and just add it on as another day, because we do usually deliver about 300 candidates a day. So we were like, okay, let's just toss in another day. We can do that if the pandemic is done by November. And at that point, we thought it would be done by November. I think everyone thought it would be done by November. So we just pushed it out to November. We put in communication plans and stuff like that. And I do need to mention that immediately at that point, we had formed an exam committee for decision making, comprising an entire bunch of stakeholders that comprised healthcare officials from CDC, candidates, board members, psychometricians, communications, IT. And so we wanted to look at impact from essentially all perspectives, so we can get residents impact, candidates impact, fellowship, people in the fellowship, program directors, their viewpoints on how they would be impacted by the decisions that we were making. So when we pushed it out to November, we wanted to gain perspectives on how that would impact them. And we did that right from the beginning, which was one of the things that was appreciated about the decision-making process. I got a question right now if whether the multiple choice qualifying test is given at only one test site for all test takers. It's given at Pearson VUE, but at multiple locations, multiple states, so they can take it close to wherever they stay. Since it's 1,600 candidates or so, they can just take it at whatever site is closest to them. So how we had made moving along, we had a particular decision tree on what exactly our priorities are and how we would address them for each situation. So we had gone step by step for within that decision tree of how we would address this. And so our primary concern, like everyone else, was safety of every stakeholder involved. So safety, safety, safety always came first. The second thing was it needed to be, any plan that we created needed to be logistically feasible. So like moving to a virtual exam on a virtual platform, if it wasn't logistically feasible for the organization or any vendor we chose, if it wasn't logistically feasible, we were not just going to transition to it. It needed to be feasible for everyone working within the organization as well as outside. And that was our secondary. So when we came up with thoughts and the decision tree, we chose to move a couple of things down and we chose to move a couple of things up. The third thing we had in mind was the defensibility of the assessment. So that came third after logistically feasible. And the defensibility of the assessment ties into public safety as well, because that depends on the safety of women. We're board certifying physicians that need to go out in the field and be board certified. So if board certification is tied into better doctors, that also impacts healthcare. So that came third. And then finally, we tried as hard as possible not to push out the assessment more than a year. So if you think about the April exams for subspecialists, we didn't want to move more than a year out because these physicians have been prepping for this exam. Yes, agreed. And so we tried as hard as possible not to push the exam out more than a year since the physicians have been prepping for this exam. So ideally, yes, sure, exam would be virtual. It might have been a pipe dream, but anyway, we took all of these considerations into account. The next thing that hit was the summer exam, which was in June. At that point, Pearson VUE was closed. It just wasn't open and we could not test there. However, by July, they had opened up at 50% capacity. And so we actively chose, in going through each one of our decision tree, we chose to make the decision to keep our exam, our qualifying exam, and test at the Pearson VUE sites at a 50% capacity with social distancing, masking, and all of those measures. So we kept our qualifying exam as is about 2 weeks after our initially scheduled qualifying exam, our written exam. So when going through our decision tree, we had the option of moving it to virtual. However, we thought our assessment may be compromised. we still did think about the safety of all stakeholders in terms of whether Pearson VUE could accommodate the 50% capacity, that sort of thing. It was logistically feasible. The defensibility of the assessment, of course, it stayed intact in terms of how it was delivered, because it was just being delivered as is. And since we were trying as hard as possible not to postpone it, we were fine there. In terms of the percent of withdrawals that we had about a 2.5% of people withdrawing, which in surveying later our candidate population, again, we went through the idea of gathering feedback from our exam committee, residents, fellows, program directors, and I think the satisfaction was high on actually keeping the exam as is. And so that was our qualifying exam for both our specialty and our subspecialty. We kept the exam as is for that. Then moving into November, for our specialty certifying exam, which is the oral exam, we tried as hard as possible to get our virtual exams going with our vendor. However, logistically, that was just not feasible. Our vendor was unfortunately not able to pull things completely through, and we wanted to get a solid defensible exam together, and it was just not logistically feasible. We also were not able to, it was an oral exam. We did not want to put our staff at risk. We did not want to put our candidates at risk, of course. And so we decided to move out the exam again, and we moved it to February, but we did change the format and administration of the exam to a multiple choice exam. And that was administered last month. Since the exam is still being scored, I won't go into too much detail about that. But going through the decision tree, we decided that the safety of our candidates, our staff, was paramount. And it was logistically feasible. We just could not get the virtual exams together at that point, but we needed to try as hard not to postpone it, and for them to retain their knowledge. They have been studying over time. So that was, we feel like, the best response, the best way to go. Finally, our April certifying exam that's happening next month for subspecialists, we were able to get our virtual exams together with our vendor. We are doing a pilot this month, next week actually, with our vendor in order to ensure that everything is in alignment the way we need it to be. And this, again, I think this whole idea of decision tree, making that, going through our exam committee, making sure that all the stakeholders are involved, the communications department is involved, sending out all of these mass messages to everyone, even though it's kind of torturous to read, making sure everyone's on board with this idea is really helpful. And then testing prior to actually having the exam, the virtual exam, I think has been really helpful, because we've done internal testing all week, and now we will be testing it next week. So I think that is has been really helpful so far. And then again, this decision tree of going through, we are maintaining safety of all stakeholders, it's being logistically feasible, and then this whole idea of defensibility of assessment, coming up with that whole decision tree and who needs to prioritize what and what's most important. I think internally coming up with that was hard, but having that discussion was really important in order to make those decisions. And I think that's all I have. And I will hand it over to Susan now.
Great, thank you, Pooja, and thanks all to the presenters for sharing what they've kind of gone through over this past year. Got a few questions that I want to kick off with. One of the first ones is thinking about something each of you touched on. Phil, you mentioned the response team and the response process. Pooja, you were just talking about the decision tree. Judy, you were talking about all hands on deck to figure this out. It sounds like each of you kind of had your own way of doing that, but all had to put something or to work through making these decisions. Couple part question here is, outside your internal staff, who else was involved in either weighing in on these decisions or helping to make these decisions about how you would respond to this, to COVID? And then I'll also add, if you have any advice to share of other programs that, you know, will think, hey, we didn't have a decision tree, we didn't have a response team, how do we organize this? So Phil, I'll start with you. Can you share a little bit about who was all involved in making those decisions, and what advice do you have to give about that process looking back? I think you're on mute. I think I can.
The most known phrase in all of the company, you're on mute. Outside of the internal staff, so like activating this crisis response team we have, that's sort of internal. But the two pieces of external communication that became really important for me and the council was that I respond to a board of directors and ensuring that board of directors was kept informed. So we actually established two things. One, an immediate emergency, my ability to emergency send to every board of director decisions and responses at any time of the day. So our technology group got together and set that up. That was very good. The other, I said two, it's probably ultimately three. The other one was the ability to contact individuals at Pearson VUE, who is the test provider, at the appropriate level. So the idea was, at Pearson VUE, we have a program manager, but I wanted to be able to call Bob Whalen at any point in time if I need him, meaning the president. I want a direct line. So set that up pretty quick, or Don Wagner. So there was a hierarchy here where I could get to the right people for decisions quick, because running it from the bottom up in a crisis management work, because that meant Pearson also had to start going this way and then back down to get me an answer. And I wanted a crisis manager to be able to get the answer quickly. So that was really important to me. The third, it wasn't about decisions, but I want to say this. The other thing that helped me a lot was a network of people like here on NCME that I knew ran programs. And I said, I'm going to start calling those. What are you doing? What are you thinking about? It was about getting information from other people in exactly the same situation to see if they were doing something that I hadn't thought about. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Judy, what about you? You mentioned kind of all these different stakeholder groups that are involved in your world. So who else was involved in making these decisions?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, so the big divide was, do you give it in person, this portable score, this 2-day test, or do you give it digitally? Do you deliver it digitally? People are taking the test in their own apartments, which is unfathomable really for the bar exam. And I didn't say this before, but it's a half-length test, but it was also remotely, the security was record and review. And we used one of the vendors, ExamSoft, that was already providing services to most jurisdictions in the bar exam space. So we spent hours and hours and hours as staff members. We collaborate pretty closely with jurisdictions, and those, that's typically through their boards of admission staff, who are working through their policymakers, are working with them, their bar examiners who are working with the people who make the big decisions, and that is in almost every state, it's the state Supreme Court. So I would say we worked very carefully with our boards of admission staff, some bar examiners, some courts were certainly wanted to be apprised and wanted to know what the options were, and certainly these were big issues for NCBE's Board of Trustees to decide. And so, what we learned is that we needed to be very communicative, and so we had lots of webinars and lots of meetings with stakeholders to make sure that they understood the trade-offs and what the decision process was, and there were no perfect solutions in this world, but we felt like we really needed to meet our stakeholder needs. And they wanted to meet, and we all wanted to keep candidates safe and to give candidates a chance to become licensed. I will point out, for all the states that gave an in-person exam in July, there were no reported cases of any COVID transmissions, and there was webinar after webinar among our admissions groups about how to do that safely. And they had developed, depending on the kind of situation that they were in, did they have 25 people or did they have, 1,500, how they could do that safely.
That's great. Pooja, what about you? You mentioned the decision tree, even developing that and then working through it. Who all was involved in that?
So internally, we developed the decision tree. However, we ran it by the exam committee, which involved, again, residents, fellows, program directors, people from CDC, our board of directors, and then internal staff. We had IT, our psychometricians, our associate executive director. So essentially, I mean, we had input from all directions, our division members as well. And so getting that committee together was definitely helpful. Getting all perspectives in was definitely the most helpful part, because you get viewpoints from every side, and things that one person has missed out comes from the other side.
Mm-hmm. So you each talked about major changes that you made, whether it was opening up the variability of how the bar exam would be administered, or moving from an oral exam to a multiple choice exam, or shortening the exam. So I'm curious how candidate groups or other stakeholder groups responded when you finally announced your decisions and said, hey, here's why. So Judy, I'll start with you on this one. How was that news about the bar exam received?
Well, it was a mixed bag. I mean, just like, are you going to do an exam in person? Are you going to do it remote? You can, and think back to last spring, people were in really different places, and different regions of the country were under really different circumstances. So I think it's fair to say there was not a common view, which is part of the reason we offered the options that we did. I think among stakeholders, courts and boards of admission were grateful and realized it was the best that we could do. I was in a meeting with some chief justices, and I said, the gold standard is an in-person exam, especially for a high stakes exam like a licensing exam. And the Supreme Court justice said, compared to what? If you can't do that now, so what are the options? And so that was really what we found that we were in. And so I think so. Again, I think boards and courts were grateful for the added opportunities that we gave them. I think law schools were a mixed bag, because there were some law schools that said, under these circumstances, it's unfair to even expect someone to be able to test under these very difficult conditions with the pandemic. And then there was, the racial injustice and the unrest that happened over the summer. And so people said, you shouldn't even be giving a bar exam. And we pointed out, it's not our decision about whether an exam is given, but it's our obligation. If a court thinks it needs to go ahead with the licensing exam, that we need to provide these high quality materials, and we need to give them an opportunity to do that. And then, we did hear from, some students who didn't want to do that, but also people who aren't as vocal, who, basically said, thank you for giving us this opportunity to put this behind us, to be able to get our license and to go out and, enter this profession and serve the public.
And just to follow up there, were the law schools advocating for the diploma privilege option that you mentioned in your July graph?
Some were. I mean, most states, if you go back, and I can maybe send a link to our website because we have prior COVID updates, but in addition to having the map and having the tables, There were diploma privilege petitions in probably most states in the country. And they were, it was a combination. Sometimes it was maybe like the law faculty from a particular jurisdiction writing the court. In some cases, it was more sort of student driven. So I think most law schools, thought, well, there is going to be an exam. And so we appreciate the fact that there are these different modalities and different times for people to do it. Although, they didn't like the delay because, the longer you delay, it takes time to grade. And then students are just that much further behind in terms of getting a job and being able to start. But, in that regard too, we really did the best that we could. And I think it would have been very challenging for jurisdictions. And honestly, for us to pull together a remote exam much earlier than we did.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Pooja, what about you? Like you mentioned, you had candidates preparing for the exams, and now the format changed a little bit. How did they respond to that?
Susan, no one's going to be 100% happy with, any decision you make. People are going to complain about something or another. I think people were happy with the fact that it was within the same year. The good thing was we gave them the option of, if you don't want to take it, you don't have to take it. You can obviously slate it for the year after, which I think was beneficial to people that don't like testing in a multiple choice format. And we did get a couple of withdrawals there, but it really wasn't a lot. People were happy. There were a couple of people that wanted to, that essentially just said, we're subspecialists. We just need to get a freebie and we don't need to test. And so, there were just a couple of people that did that, but besides that, I think people were happy that they got to test within the year.
Great. So Phil, you reduced the length of your exam. So I doubt many candidates would complain about that, but what was the response? How did your field react to that change?
Actually, the field was pretty worried that you could take a critical exam and in 72 hours short and get the same measurement. There was a lot of skepticism, to be honest with you. Where I got the most pushback probably was not from the candidate, but from the educators, for fear that we had just made the exam harder or disadvantaged the candidate who needed 6 hours. I'll tell you the way that we managed that was probably more on communication, but communication with the regulators. We probably viewed our decision tree just a little bit differently than Pooja, and that was, we didn't layer it. We said safety is important, but if you don't have a defensible exam, then public safety is probably hindered. And so we didn't separate those two. And so when you went to regulators, what's their job? I didn't have to convince students. I had to convince regulators about public safety. And if I gave them an exam in which we altered it in some way that they could not make safe decisions about public safety, that they were going to be in jeopardy. And so getting them to be my echo chamber out to the 70,000 and at the end of the year around 300,000 candidates was probably the most helpful. But there was pushback, not from the candidates, more from the educators.
Interesting. So one of the questions that I had posed to you guys in advance, and I think this has actually come up in the chat once or twice, was about a time limit on these changes, right? So some of you have kind of mentioned that, but kind of how do you, that's one of, I know, a concern that faced a number of credentialing programs is, if we make a change, how do we walk it back? And if we say we can do this now, why can't we do it in a year? Whether it be remote proctoring or a change in format or the change in the length. So Pooja, I'll start with you. Have you had anyone say, well, hey, I wasn't ready, but I want to take that multiple choice exam rather than the full board exam?
I think our communications were pretty clear about this is going to be a one-time deal. And every single time we put communications out, it was this is because of the pandemic, we are changing our format for a virtual format or the multiple choice format. So I think within our communications was so important for that. Otherwise, it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so just to answer your question, I don't specifically think we are going back. And I'm hopeful that communications was clear in that.
Sure. So what about you for this one? How are you kind of going to manage this one moving forward?
So I can tell you exactly. So what we did was got board approval for the first quarter. Remember, we publish it every quarter, right? So the first quarter, because we weren't sure, we ran our simulations, but we needed real data. The real data come back and held. So I went back to the board, got another quarter approval to do it. And at that end of that quarter, I went to the board and said, I can find no reason why we would have our candidates sit for 6 hours when this actual change to the exam had no impact on item parameters. All of our parameters stay stable, that it seemed actually somewhat unethical to then tell them they got to go back and add 2 more hours back into this exam. And so we made a proclamation at that point in time, we were not going back. This exam was stable. It measured equivalently, had over the quarters, and the simulation and evidence that we'd run suggested would for the future quarters, and it has. So we said from that point forward, this was our exam.
Great. Judy, what about you with what you showed kind of in the variability from the February map? July map still has some remote administration mixed in with in-person administration. Is there a potential continuation of the remote administration, or is that going to hopefully wind down as the pandemic does?
Well, certainly when we started this, it was a port in a storm, and it was, compared to what we needed to do something, and this is what we were going to do. So now we will have offered this for 3 times with the July 21 exam. And what's going on at NCBE is we started 3 years ago a comprehensive study to look at how should the bar exam change for the future. And that study stayed on schedule. It ended in December, and we now have a plan for the bar exam of the future, which looks at no longer a paper-based test, again, pre-pandemic paper-based test, but a computer delivery model. Whether that's in person at these jurisdiction sites, as has been done heretofore before the pandemic, or if it's at test centers. I don't know that yet. As you all know, it's pretty hard to do an event-based test that's 12 hours long at a test center. So, we're looking at everything. I think our inclination is that it will not be a remote delivery exam. It will go back to an in-person administration. And I think jurisdictions, probably there's some difference of opinion there, but I think most recognize that an in-person administration is, again, the gold standard.
Great, thanks. So there's been a couple of questions in the chat. I just want to and I know several of you have mentioned this in different ways, but I want to kind of circle back and really cover this. Given that the changes that you made, did you put into place any extra monitoring either during the exam or after the exam to, again, confirm that the changes didn't lead to any kind of security issues or changes in the meaning of the defensibility of scores? What additional, again, analyses or monitoring are you doing? And Phil, I'll go back to you. You talked a little bit about that just in this last question, but how did you kind of start this when you announced this big change and started administering the test?
So I'm not sure where the question's going, but so if I missed this, please tell me and say that's not what I asked you. All right. So realized that we had done this early research, taking an entire year's data and running it through a new exam. And found out using all of the same item parameters that we would have used in terms of infits, outfits, drifts, the whole thing. We kept it all where it was at. It stayed stable. We didn't change any of those and have not. But if the question is, how did you know that was working in real data, is that we also didn't change anything because we look at our data every day. So it's not, we just have this heuristic and process where we're looking at that every day. So we have markers that say that ding us if an item is drifting or if a parameter is changing. This is already sort of built into our process. So we would watch that. Now, we did have to watch pass rates and see if they were going to change, because if you think about it, Susan, one of the things you didn't know was the human effect of the pandemic. So did you early on get high performers who were very confident and not scared? That's a different mental thing. And did it impact your test? So we started watching, was that going to change? We had, much like Judy had, this thing called graduate work permits. And so were these graduate work permits who normally wouldn't have got a chance to work, was it going to impact their scores because it's changing their education, right? So we did put in those sort of markers to try to figure that out, and didn't see any huge impact at this point. So for instance, we know our fourth quarter testing, which is always sort of the people who are the furthest from graduation or are there retesting, always have the lowest ability distribution. Pass or failed, it's different. And checking that from quarter to quarter, it has matched. So we kept all that in place, but quite frankly, it was already there. So my answer is we really didn't change anything. I won't say that we didn't watch it closer because there was more fear, because we've gotten comfortable over the years going, it's going to work, it's going to work, going to work. We probably approached this, oh, we're not really sure this is going to work, so we'll watch it closer every minute or that sort of thing. But the actual parameters we didn't change. We wanted to make sure they matched.
Data review every day helps.
Yeah.
Judy, you were just sharing in the chat, I think, that you saw a very low impact to the even average scale score. So how were you looking at this, by jurisdiction, or how could you kind of keep an eye on that data?
Yeah, that was very interesting to us. I first want to pick up on something that Phil said. You know, I just put a link in there. There were 10 states that gave 2 exams. And I think without exception, those states had some of their highest means ever for the first exam that they gave. And then the second exam they gave, it was unbelievable. If you look at the first state in there, I think it's Alabama, and I think their pass rate on their first in-person exam was 71% and their second was 29%. And so that's like one of these really enormous differences, but some of the others were closer, but we saw that time and time again. And so I don't know what that means, but that you can see that in this chart that was reported. We're very concerned about the security of items. We're pretty conservative. So we are, we have for years hired outside people to web monitor and see if our items have been compromised, and we look for item drift. And so far, honestly, we've not seen that for these items that were administered in October. And, it's too early to know about February, but we've kept an eye on that as well. We didn't score the October exam. We gave it away for free, but we have the data, and that was part of it. We wanted to study it and we wanted to look. So we can see how those items performed in the past and how they performed on this exam. And they were remarkably close, which I think is something like a half a point off on a 150 about score scale. So, I think that gave us a lot more confidence, and we'll be very interested. We haven't done it yet, but we're going to be very interested too to look at the February data as well.
Pooja, what are your thoughts here? What additional monitoring are you doing?
So for our upcoming virtual versus in-person exams, of course, we're looking at pass rates, comparability to prior exams. We're conducting focus groups with examiners on perception of, because we use examiners over time. So we are doing focus groups with them on perceptions of virtual versus in-person, that sort of thing. With proctors, we're doing surveys with examinees from the pilot. We are capturing information during their grading process, during examiner grading process as well, on things like technical difficulties, aberrant behavior, that sort of thing. And then we're looking at reliability, comparison of reliability case statistics, rater statistics, that sort of thing. And so those are and then again, as Judy mentioned, we also hire someone externally to look at web patrolling, data forensics as well.
So ongoing. Okay, lots of interesting research, and I see some ideas popping up in the chat about the types of studies and things like that. Just kind of a follow-up. Judy, you were asked about what you mean that you didn't score the October test. Was it a field test or pilot? I think you were saying it was done by the states.
Jurisdictions scored that exam. We precisely for all the changes that we were making, but jurisdictions wanted something. So we made our exam materials available, but jurisdictions scored those exams on their own. So they weren't pilot testing, they were actually used for admissions decisions. And I mentioned earlier that, because it wasn't a uniform bar exam, it wasn't the full length exam that NCBE wasn't scoring, it was for a local admission only. And there was quite a reaction to that you can imagine. Examinees wanted that score portability, especially for some of these states where there's a lot of cross-border practice. So 13 or 14 of the jurisdictions that gave that remote exam using NCBE materials ended up agreeing to their own examinee transfers and allowing transfers depending on if you made the cut score in the receiving jurisdiction. So they did their own sort of UBE workaround in the absence of NCBE scoring it and certifying it as a UBE exam.
Okay, thanks. So kind of as we head towards the end of our time here together, the last question, we've talked about making the decision and rolling out the decisions, the reactions, and monitoring it. Now the question is, we are a year later, 1 year past when Phil probably got that phone call that there was maybe 20 hours left of testing or something like that. So a year later, we're still going through this, but looking back, would you do anything different? How would you have had a different response process or made decisions differently? Not an easy question to kind of kick off with. So Pooja, I'll start with you on this one. What are your thoughts here?
That is a hard question. I think we went through a process of careful decision making. And given that we did get input from an entire committee and then gathered input after the exams as well to ensure that our candidates were satisfied with our decision-making processes, I think we have so far been lucky in that our qualifying exams, written exams in the summer went well. There weren't any reported cases, at least, of anyone getting sick after the exam, that sort of thing. And then I don't know about our pilot yet. Next week, I will let you know how that goes. And so I think we have been lucky in that we have made appropriate decisions along the way. And I don't know the other side, right? If we had made another decision, how that would have gone. But I think so far we have been good in our decision making, and we have used the right people to make those decisions. I think that has been good for us.
Great, thanks. Phil, what about you? Any reflections now almost a year later?
Well, if I'm ever here again, I hope there are other options. But given that that's not really what the question was, I will say this. The one thing that I would probably, looking back, do differently is that I would have spent a little more time in that first 72 hours working with Pearson VUE to set up a more aligned crisis communication approach, so that the council and Pearson's crisis communication teams were more aligned. That could have went smoother, but that would be, I think that if I could do that again, in retrospect, I would have prioritized that a little higher than waiting around 30 days to go, this communication isn't working, so let's fix this part of it, right? I think I'd have started that earlier.
Judy, what about you?
Ooh, I mean, that's a tough question. You know, I look at the July map, and we had very few states that ended up doing those 2 later exams. So, you know, did we need to offer 3 in-person exams? I will tell you, at the time we did that, the thought from the bar admissions community to serve their student population, their examinee population, was absolutely. So, you know, we were acting as best we could with the knowledge that we had about what we thought might happen with the pandemic. But I would say that even between what we offered for July and what we offered for February looks quite different. We said, you know, we're not going to do multiple in-person opportunities. It's going to be a bimodal test given at the same time, and states are going to have to make that decision. And the states, I think, appreciated that and went with that as well. So I think that already is a lesson learned for us that we incorporated for this year, and what we'll incorporate for later this year in July.
That's great. Well, I want to thank the 3 of you for sharing your experiences. I think this has been obviously probably one of the most unique situations we've all found ourselves in working in assessment. And I can't imagine that we would have ever dreamt of a world where testing just wasn't possible in person or in a test center for any period of time like this. So I want to applaud all of you for making all the decisions that you had to make and then rolling those out and communicating. And I cannot imagine that the last year was easy. I think kind of what we're seeing from the chat and from hearing from the 3 of you as a sample of credentialing programs out there, there's going to be a lot of great, hopefully post-pandemic research opportunities to share what we've learned about making decisions when your program is faced with a crisis, about mode effects, about candidates' choice and interaction with different opportunities and formats. And so I encourage everyone who's on this call, I see a lot of different programs represented, to think about how they can share that research with our community and we can learn from one another. Just before we wrap up today, I want to just make a plug for next week. We have 2 more of these sessions left. Next week, we're going to be talking about some other assessments. We've talked a lot about K-12, we've talked credentialing, and now we're going to be looking at some other measures and how the pandemic has affected them. So it'll be a really interesting discussion to see what similarities and differences we identify. And then there's one more session after that. Again, save the date for the NCME 2021 conference. Registration is now open. I think Erin even put it in the chat for us. So thank you again for joining today. Thanks to our presenters. And we really learned a lot by having you all here as guests of NCME. So thank you, folks. Have a good day.